This is the Samsung S21 Ultra, and this is the iPhone 12 Pro Max, and this is the Samsung Note 20 Ultra. So these are like three of the most powerful smartphone cameras on the market today. And in this video I'm going to compare them to see which one is best at shooting cinematic, professional looking video. So I was actually quite surprised with the results that I got with the S21 Ultra. But let's have a look and see how they all match up.
I've been using the iPhone 12 Pro Max and the Note 20 Ultra this year, and I've been very impressed with the cameras. Especially for video, they really feel like a new stage in cameras for smartphones. But this is my first chance to try out the Samsung S21 Ultra. So note that this is the Snapdragon version, and that should be better than the Exynos version. The first thing I noticed when opening the camera is that there's an extra lens choice. There's 4 icons here instead of the 3 that you get on the iPhone and Note 20. That's because this device has 2 telephoto cameras, while the other 2 devices only have 1. Samsung calls this their new dual tele camera system. But does this system live up to their hype, and will this extra tele lens help us shoot better video? On the other hand, the iPhone has the LiDAR sensor that creates a 3-dimensional map and helps with low-light photography as well as portraits. When I selected the ultra-wide lens, it tells me that this is a 0.6 times lens, so slightly less wide than the Note 20 Ultra and the iPhone 12 Pro Max, which both have 0.5 ultra-wide lenses. That said, a quick check shows me that both the ultra-wide lenses on all 3 devices give a 120-degree field of view. The iPhone 12 Pro Max has the least powerful telephoto lens of all, at 2.5 magnification. Meanwhile, the Note 20 Ultra has a 5 times tele lens, and the S21 Ultra has a 3 times tele lens and a 10 times tele lens. I'm only talking about the optical power of the telephoto lenses here, because you can zoom in further with all 3 devices, but you're then using digital zoom, which usually involves a gradual decrease in quality the further you zoom. Right, let's focus on the main sensor of each device, because that's where you're gonna be doing most of your work. The main sensor is always gonna be the best quality camera, and I always recommend you use it over the other cameras, especially for video work. What makes these Samsung devices different from the iPhone is that they both have this 108 megapixel sensor. The iPhone main sensor has 12 megapixels, but that just illustrates that bigger spec numbers don't necessarily mean better. The plus side of all those extra pixels is potentially more detail in photos. The downside is that to fit all those extra pixels onto a sensor, which is about the same size, means the pixels have to be smaller. Smaller pixels are generally speaking worse in low light conditions. That said, Samsung has used a technology which overcomes that, called pixel binning. Another plus is that all those pixels allow the Samsungs to shoot 8K video, whereas the iPhone is limited to 4K as a maximum resolution. I don't want to get too technical, but be aware Samsung and Apple are using distinctively different technology in their smartphone cameras. All 3 devices have large main sensors, which helps to give you a nice amount of blurry background. All 3 main cameras have the biggest aperture, which also helps to create a blurrier background. The iPhone has the biggest aperture at f1.7, while the Samsungs both have f1.8 aperture. I've been using the smartphones to film myself a lot, and so far I prefer the Samsung Note 20 Ultra over the iPhone 12 Pro Max. I just find that the Note 20 has a bit more of a softer, flattering look. When I'm filming myself, I want the autofocus to lock onto my face and a nice amount of blurry background. And some flattering skin tones would be nice as well. I tested all 3 devices at 2 distances using the main sensor at 4K and 30 frames per second on auto exposure. All 3 picked up my face pretty well for autofocus. The Note 20 Ultra gives a brighter look than the other 2 devices. One thing I noticed was some extra digital noise in the darker areas for the S21 Ultra, even in these bright conditions. If you look at the leaves of the trees on the right side of the frame, you'll see this extra noise. So I feel like both Samsung devices give a shallower depth of field, noticeable when I stood further from the camera. Another thing I noticed was that the iPhone made the biggest color change as I moved into frame or turned around. This is with the camera on auto, but when I'm filming myself, I actually need the camera on auto. So for me, I prefer the way the Samsung devices don't adjust white balance just because I turn my head. So if I had to make a choice, I think I would still pick the Note 20 Ultra for filming myself, even though the auto exposure is coming out a bit too bright. There's less noise than the S21 Ultra, and less white balance changes than the iPhone. I tried filming with the main camera on all three devices at 4K and 30 frames per second. When comparing the two Samsung devices, the S21 Ultra seems to have a greater dynamic range. But again, there's digital noise in the shadows. Yeah, normally we expect noise to appear when ISO is boosted in low light conditions, but these shots are all in bright daylight where we would expect ISO to be right at the bottom and for there to be basically no noise at all. So I think we need to connect the dots here and assume that this greater dynamic range is created using software, and in other words, dynamic tone mapping. This means that to show more details in the dark areas, the S21 Ultra is pushing up the ISO, but just for those parts of the image. And that's why we see this extra noise in the shadows even in bright daylight. The iPhone 12 Pro Max is known for its aggressive dynamic tone mapping and high dynamic range. But we can see by comparing these two clips that the S21 Ultra beats the iPhone for details in the shadows. Look at the trees, and with the iPhone and the Note 20 Ultra, there's almost no detail. But with the S21 Ultra, there is detail. But, as I say, this comes at the unfortunate cost of this extra digital noise. I made some quick tests at dusk to see how each device copes with low light. I used the main video mode of each device, locking exposure and also reducing exposure. All three produced extra noise, as we would expect. Comparing the two Samsungs, I think the S21 Ultra does slightly better than the Note 20 Ultra in terms of noise produced. But when I panned with the iPhone, even though exposure was locked, you can see that the device still brightens the image of the house as I pan across. Bear in mind, this is actually quite a bit brighter than it looked to my eyes. I have to say, I find that really annoying. The iPhone has decided it knows better than me about how my video should look. And I have to say, no mate, you really don't. Not only does it look wrong and overexposed, but it produces far more noise. So we have to say that in this simple test, the Samsungs win just by not being annoying. And between the two Samsungs, I reckon that the S21 Ultra just about edges it. While the iPhone is limited to 4K, both Samsungs can shoot at 8K resolution. To shoot 8K footage, you need to go into Pro mode, then choose 8K, which is only available at 24 frames per second. There's also no lens options because you need that giant 108 megapixel sensor to capture 8K detail. So in a quick test, the S21 Ultra came out slightly better, at least to my eyes. The colors are better with some beautiful crisp detail, especially when filming closer. So I'm not going to be exporting this video in 8K. So these test clips that you can see here are being mastered at 4K down from 8K, but they should still retain some kind of extra detail. So for members, I will upload some 8K clips from you from both these phones and you can examine them at 8K. If you have an 8K monitor or television, that is. Otherwise, you won't actually be able to see all those extra pixels. So I tested out the telephoto lenses in all three devices. The iPhone's 2.5 times is the most modest with minimal magnification by comparison. On the other hand, the Samsung S21 Ultra's dual tele system is the most powerful. Well, it seems so just going by the specs. So in this shot, I switched through from the main sensor to the 3x optical lens and then to the 10x magnification. The quality remains good at 3x, but you can see that at 10x, a lot of quality is lost, and at 20x it's even more pixelated. Whereas at 5x on the Note 20 Ultra, it really is a nice, clean image. In these shots I use some foreground with the main lens and then the tele options. I'm just moving the camera very slowly to use the autofocus. Does the focus change smoothly and in an attractive way? I found all three devices have a nice, smooth movement as the focus changes, and I'd be happy to use any of these automatic focus pulls in a professional project. Using digital zoom at 4K resolution, 7 times magnification is the maximum achievable on the iPhone. For both Samsungs, shooting at 4K video resolution, 20 times magnification is the limit. But none of them produce what I would consider usable video when set at this maximum, so I really recommend you stick to this optical zoom. Out of the three devices, to my eyes, the Samsung S21 Ultra is really the least attractive to look at in terms of colour and contrast, as well as that extra noise in the shadows. I do like the more subdued, natural-looking colours from the iPhone, but for me, the Samsung Note 20 Ultra produces the best overall telephoto performance when shooting video. So all three ultra-wide cameras have a 120-degree field of view. There's not a huge quality difference between the three. I found the quality to be about equal if you ignore the extra noise from the S21 Ultra. Does the S21 Ultra give more shallow depth of field? When you're using a normal camera, one of the main uses of a telephoto lens is to create a shallow depth of field. Telephoto or long lenses are often used for portraits for this reason. But in smartphones, telephoto lenses often have smaller apertures than the main camera, so this usually negates any extra blurry background bokeh effect you might be hoping for. But the Samsung S21 Ultra has managed to pack a 10 times optical telephoto lens into this phone, so surely it must give us some extra blurry background. So I tested all three devices' telephoto lenses to see if they help us when filming a subject. Do we get extra bokeh? And yes, actually, this new 10 times optical tele lens does seem to have a shallower depth of field. I had to stand much further away from the camera, as you would expect. And in this shot, I'm about 3 or 4 meters away. And that means I'm nearer to the background. Even though I'm much closer to the background, it's still a bit more blurry than with the other cameras. That said, getting the framing and focus right is a bit more tricky with this lens. It also looks as if the focus on my face is a little bit soft. All three devices have high-quality front-facing selfie cameras. The Samsung Note 20 Ultra has a 10 megapixel sensor. The iPhone 12 Pro Max has a 12 megapixel sensor, but the S21 Ultra has an impressively large 40 megapixel sensor. All three allow you to shoot selfie videos up to 60 frames per second at 4K. You can even shoot slow motion video with the selfie cameras if you want. The Samsungs can go up to 240 frames per second in slow motion mode at 1080p, using the main camera or the selfie camera. When I tested the selfie cameras in more of a low light situation, the Samsung S21 Ultra came out the winner, with the other two producing quite a bit more noise, and that 40 megapixel sensor seemingly making the difference. While the iPhone has one mode of stabilization, the Samsungs have two types: basic stabilization and super steady for extra smoothness. As well, the Samsungs allow you to switch stabilization on and off, while the iPhone does not. The basic stabilization of all three devices seems to work at a similar level. There doesn't seem to be much difference between them. If you switch on Super Steady using this icon, the device will use digital image stabilization to add extra smoothness. However, it will also limit the footage to 1080p resolution. The Samsungs can shoot up to 960 frames per second slow motion, while the iPhone 12 Pro Max can go up to 240 frames per second. So the Samsungs have two modes: slow motion, which is pretty much the equivalent of the iPhone slow motion, and super slow motion. When you shoot in these modes, you're limited to 1080p resolution on all devices. My favorite way to capture slow motion B-roll is to shoot at 60 frames per second in 4K and then slow it to 24 frames per second when I edit. To get the smoothest footage, you want those frames per second to be as consistent as possible, but if a camera's processor struggles, the frames per second can go a bit out. So let's see how these cameras perform at 60 frames per second. In this quick test, all three devices produced 60 frames per second video very accurately, but the iPhone footage perhaps came out just a slightly more accurately. But that being said, there was so little difference and all the clips came out smoothly when slowed to 24 frames per second. While the iPhone has more choice of third-party apps to use, Samsung attempts to compensate by giving you a bunch of extras for free, ready to go. All three devices have a portrait mode for photos, but the iPhone does not have a version for video, while the Samsungs do. And considering that the iPhone has the LiDAR scanner, you might expect it to have more 3D mapping features. Portrait mode essentially creates a fake blurry background, but you can also use it to create certain effects. So to do this on the iPhone, you need an app like Focus. It's very simple to use portrait video on the Samsung devices, and it works quite well in limited situations. If you're simply talking to camera and not moving your hands around, it's just about acceptable. And once you shoot a clip of video, you can adjust it, change the effect, change the amount of effect. Generally speaking, the less effect you use, the more realistic it looks. So I found the Focus app to be somewhat more complex, and therefore it's a bit of a longer learning time. You do get more controls if you're prepared to put in the effort to get to know the app. As well, the Focus app uses the phone's LiDAR sensor to map a 3D environment, so you can only use it with the rear-facing cameras. So you can't use the selfie cameras as you can with the Samsungs.
So I just discovered that you can actually use the Focus app with the selfie camera. You just can't use the LiDAR scanner, so it just uses AI like the Samsungs. So this is what I'm doing right now. Let's see how it comes out.
So I moved around in the frame to see how well each device kept track of me and maintained the fake blurry background. Both Samsungs did quite well, but to my eyes the Note 20 Ultra does a slightly better job in the portrait video mode. The colours are a bit better and the AI does a better job at keeping track of the subject as I move around. With the iPhone I had to use the Focus app. Even using the main sensor plus the LiDAR sensor, the iPhone didn't seem to track me any better. Also, to get the focus to follow me, I had to edit in a follow focus using the app. So this took me about 20 minutes of playing around with settings in the app while the Samsung samples are straight out of the camera with no messing about. The Samsung S21 Ultra has the Director's View feature, which allows you to shoot video using your device's multiple cameras simultaneously. So you can film yourself via the selfie camera and then choose from one of the rear cameras. So this was probably useful for social media work. The Samsung Note 20 Ultra has a similar feature called dual recording, but it's a bit more basic than Director's View. And to do this on the iPhone, you will need to download an app like Filmmaking Double Take, for example. Both Samsung devices come with a Pro Photo and Pro Video mode, which allows you to have manual control over your device's cameras. In other words, you can set white balance, set focus, set shutter speed, and so on. However, when you do this, it overrides the dynamic tone mapping, meaning you will get less dynamic range. And this can be quite a dramatic difference, especially in the S21 Ultra, which is using aggressive tone mapping software. The good thing is that you can no longer see that noise in the shadows. To my eyes, once you switch off the dynamic tone mapping by using Pro Video mode, you get a much nicer looking image, albeit with a lot less dynamic range. The details seem cleaner, whereas when the dynamic tone mapping is on, my guess is that the S21 Ultra is using pretty aggressive noise reduction to control the noise created by the tone mapping. The thing about noise reduction is that it makes the image look softer and more digital. It kind of rounds off the edges. To get some kind of pro mode on the iPhone, again, you will need a third-party app. There are quite a few good ones, starting with the famous Filmic Pro app. Note that with the iPhone, your third-party app will not turn off the dynamic tone mapping, like it does on the Samsungs, and this means you never have full control of the exposure. One downside of Pro Video mode on the Samsungs is that the tele lenses are not available, and on the Samsungs that's true even when you use a third-party app. However, using a third-party app on the iPhone does allow access to the tele lens. Both Samsung devices can shoot in the HDR10+ format, which is another dynamic tone mapping system to add extra dynamic range. Meanwhile, the latest iPhones have the option to shoot Dolby Vision. This process adds the appearance of extra brightness to the final video. It also records in 10-bit color instead of 8-bit. 10-bit color gives you a much greater range of color depth. So while you can see the difference if you just view the clip on your device, if you want to share the clip, things get a bit more complicated. If you want to shoot and edit HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision footage, you must make sure you are editing it and mastering the footage in the correct color space. And not all platforms support HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision, but YouTube does, for example. If a video is mastered correctly and uploaded in one of these formats, you will see HDR written in the settings cog after YouTube has finished processing the video. But there's one more obstacle which might prevent your viewers from seeing the video in HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision, because to view these HDR formats, we need a compatible monitor. If the viewer doesn't have the right monitor, most of the time, the video will just look like SDR, standard dynamic range. But occasionally, the colors and exposure are way off, so it might look bleached out and contain strange colors. This video is published in SDR, so I can't compare the HDR10 Plus with Dolby Vision. However, I'll include some HDR clips for members on Patreon to check out. You might be able to find some videos uploaded in Dolby Vision or HDR10 Plus on YouTube somewhere. So personally, I find Dolby Vision is easier to use. Apple has made editing Dolby Vision clips directly on your phone easy using iMovie. You can also easily edit it using LumaFusion. Just make sure to get the right color space. Basically, there's much less information and support for shooting and editing Samsung's HDR10 Plus, but I found the iPhone's Dolby Vision very easy to set up, edit, and master. You can also shoot Dolby Vision using the selfie camera on the iPhone, but you can't do the same with the HDR10 Plus on the Samsungs. So if I had to pick one of these phones, which one would I choose? Can you guess? They're all pretty close and there's no out-and-out winner. However, I think I would pick the Samsung Note 20 Ultra for its all-round video shooting quality. Shooting in auto on the main sensor looks great. The 5x telephoto produces pretty great video. And portrait video comes out on top too. The Dolby Vision on the iPhone 12 Pro Max is streets ahead of the HDR10 Plus from the Samsungs, and so convenient and easy to use by comparison. One thing I discovered while filming, which I hadn't noticed before, on the Note 20 Ultra, when I selected 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, you lose access to the lens picker. In other words, you're restricted to the main sensor only. Whereas both the iPhone 12 Pro Max and S21 Ultra allow access to all lenses at 4K and 60 frames per second. Actually, another thing I just spotted, which is a difference between the two Samsungs, the S21 Ultra has this auto frame rate setting. So it's called FHD Auto, and what this means is that the camera will adjust the frame rate depending on the conditions, between 30 and 60 frames per second. And actually the iPhone has a similar feature, but it's hidden in the camera settings. If you intend on editing lots of video clips together, you will usually want a consistent frame rate. And so the reason for this dynamic variable frame rate is that it ensures your video's look stays consistent even as the lighting changes. Yeah, so what do you think? I've made my choice. What is your choice? Which one do you think is best? This is the S21 Ultra. I'm just using the microphone, inbuilt microphone, so you can see what it sounds like. Thanks to all the patrons who joined recently. Great to see that. And I'm going to put some extras in from the HDR stuff. Links to that for the patrons, for the members. And if you want to join us, it'd be great to see you there. So until next time, bye.